Welcome to this Meanwhile Elsewhere video on the Scramble for Africa. So what we're going to look at in this video is that in the 19th century, much of the continent of Africa was colonised by European countries such as Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands and Portugal. Now, the rush for European powers to take control of parts of Africa became known as the Scramble for Africa. So the main historical concepts that we're going to learn about within this video are the Benin bronzes, which were brass sculptures made in Benin that were looted by British forces in 1897. We're going to talk about the Berlin Conference, which was a conference held in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 to divide up land in Africa to prevent war actually breaking out between European countries and tension, etc. Colony is a place or a country that is controlled by another as part of an empire. A missionary is a person who seeks to spread their religious ideas, such as Christianity, often trying to convert people to that faith. And the scramble for Africa is when European countries, such as Britain, took control of and colonised huge parts of Africa in the late 19th century. Okay, so you can see on this map a really important visual of the colonisation of Africa by Europeans, which mainly took place in the 19th century and into the start of the 20th century. So you can see there, for example, within West Africa, there was huge swathes of land that were controlled by the French. We can also see, for example, those kind of purple territories controlled by the Portuguese. A few Spanish colonies up in the northwest of the continent. A few Italian colonies such as Libya and Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, for example, and then some German territories as well, such as Southwest Africa. And then we can see all of those British territories colour-coded in that kind of sort of reddy colour there. So we can see places like the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, Nigeria. We can see down there in South Africa, huge portions of land were controlled by the British Empire as well. Very few independent countries were left. Ethiopia was one of them, and Liberia as well. And you can see there Egypt, although the British took control of quite a fair bit of Egypt in the early 20th century. So until about the 1800s, European nations were not interested particularly in having an empire in Africa. They traded with Africa to gain resources like gold, salt and ivory. And we also know they captured, enslaved and transported people from the west of Africa. But Britain had banned this slave trade in 1807. Obviously, the slave trade did still continue after that with other countries. But even in 1870, only 10% of Africa had been taken over, colonised by European countries. But by 1900, this figure was 90%. And that's why this is known as the Scramble for Africa. So one important event to know about is the Berlin Conference, which took place between 1884 and 1885. And there's an illustration there of the Berlin Conference from a German magazine called Illustrierte Zeitung, there where you can see big map of Africa in the background there, and kind of like this conference, and there were meetings before and after the conference as well. The main European powers were literally carving up the continent of Africa. Now, the conference actually organised by a German politician called Otto von Bismarck, but the new German emperor, who's called Kaiser Wilhelm II, had talked about having a place in the sun, and he thought the colonies in Africa would make Germany more powerful. So that's kind of like some of the context of the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. So why did Britain in particular want to take control of colonies in Africa? Well, firstly, Africa was rich in valuable raw materials like gold and diamonds. There were other resources there like palm oil and rubber, which were important for the Industrial Revolution that was going on in Britain at that time. Missionaries sought to convert African people to Christianity. Scientific advances such as the use of quinine to treat malaria meant the British were more likely to survive in Africa and enabled Britain to colonise Africa. Other European countries were competing with Britain in order to have the largest empire. So there's a certain amount of Britain wanting to make sure that it kept the largest empire, and therefore it wanted to take control of colonies in Africa. And many European and also British people held racist views that they were superior to African people. This meant they believed they had a right or even a duty to rule the continent of Africa. And many of these racist views, as we've learnt about, stemmed from Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so Britain took control of many colonies, and we can see here's a list of some of those different colonies. And again, you can see the map there where some of those different places actually are. So we're going to look at three examples of the scramble for Africa and the experience of people of the British Empire within Africa during the 19th century. So the first one we're going to find out about is the Anglo-Zulu War. So there is a picture there of King Cetshwayo, who was the last Zulu king before the British took control of this area. And we're going to focus on the Anglo-Zulu War, and in particular we're going to learn about two battles, Battle of Isandlwana and then the event of Rorke's Drift as well. But before we do that, we're just going to talk about who the Zulu people were. So the Zulu people were an indigenous group or nation from the southern part of Africa. Zulu people farmed the lands to grow crops, and many Zulus were skilled weavers and pottery makers. The word Zulu means sky. Now, by the 1870s, a new king called Cetshwayo was in charge of the Zulu nation. The British had already colonised other parts of southern Africa and wanted to take control of what they called Zululand. Gold and diamonds had been found in the region, and of course those kinds of natural resources were some of the things that encouraged the increase in colonisation in the 19th century. Now, King Cetshwayo prepared to defend his lands, prepared for war by purchasing thousands of guns, and he wanted to defend his lands from a colonial takeover. Now, in December 1878, the British gave Cetshwayo a final warning to get rid of the Zulu army and allow Britain to move into the area. They said that if he ignored this, then they would invade. When King Cetshwayo gave no reply, the British invaded Zululand with their soldiers and also soldiers from an organisation called the NNC, which is the Natal Native Contingent, which were local native people that were working with the British Army at the time. Now, the British were defeated very famously at the Battle of Isandlwana on Wednesday, the 22nd of January 1879. This was a humiliating and comprehensive defeat for the British. 1,700 British and NNC soldiers were killed within that battle. Zulu forces also attacked 150 British and NNC soldiers at Rorke's Drift on the same day, and here the British forces fought off multiple attacks for 10 hours before the Zulus retreated. Unsurprisingly, the British media and the British focused on this event, and you can see a very famous painting that was painted by Alphonse de Neuville in 1880, showing the defence of Rorke's Drift. They actually gave out 11 Victoria Crosses for bravery after the event at Rorke's Drift. The war continued for another 6 months, but in July 1879, the British organised a huge attack on the royal city of Ulundi, which you can see there to the east of Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, and the Zulus were defeated. And Cetshwayo himself, King Cetshwayo, was captured and sent to London. Now, actually, in London, Cetshwayo became a really popular figure. People were charmed by his manner and his talking. He met with Queen Victoria and the Prime Minister. He was cheered by crowds when he appeared in public. But he returned to Southern Africa in 1883, but died shortly afterwards. But by this time, Zululand had been split into 13 regions and was absorbed into the British Empire as part of South Africa. Next one we're going to find out about is Benin. So the Benin Empire was a powerful kingdom located in what is now southwest Nigeria. The Benin bronzes were important brass artifacts that told the stories of the obas or the rulers of Benin. Now, in the 19th century, Benin was wealthy and important, having traded raw materials like rubber and gold with European traders. The kingdom had also sold a number of enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in the late 19th century, the British took control of Benin and incorporated it into their colony of Nigeria. The British tried to increase their control over trade in Benin in the late 19th century, and in 1897 a group of British officials went on an expedition to Benin to try and increase trade links. Now, Benin warriors attacked the British force, forcing them to retreat. Now, in retaliation, the British went on an expedition to Benin City. British forces burned the city to the ground and hanged 6 of the chiefs. The Oba, the ruler of Benin, was forced into exile, and Benin was added to the British colony of Nigeria. Now, at this time, many treasures were taken from the palace in Benin City, including the Benin bronzes, which were looted and they were sold to various European museums. There's a very famous picture here where you can see the British forces with the looted Benin bronzes in 1897. Now, today, some of the Benin bronzes, as you can see them here, can be found in the British Museum. That's quite controversial in terms of where the Benin bronzes perhaps should be located. And of course, there are many people that think that they should remain in the British Museum, but there are, of course, many people that think that the Benin bronzes should be returned to Nigeria. Okay, so the last example that we're going to talk about in this presentation about Scramble for Africa is the Ndebele Kingdom. Now, the Ndebele Kingdom. In the late 19th century, the Ndebele Kingdom claimed control of a large part of southern Africa. But in 1888, a British imperialist called Cecil Rhodes heard rumours that gold had been discovered in the Ndebele Kingdom. Now, Rhodes sent men to negotiate with the ruler, who was King Lobengula. The British verbally promised they would not take any territory, but when the written treaty was signed, King Lobengula had been tricked into signing away much of his kingdom. These lands were included into a new colony called Rhodesia, created in 1895. The Ndebele people were moved to reserves, which made up only 22% of the colony. Cecil Rhodes created the British South Africa Company to mine for gold and gain new territory in Rhodesia. Rhodes was an example of an imperialist who held racist views. In his will, he had said, "I contend that we, the white British, are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Okay, so thank you very much for listening to that. We've focused today on the Scramble for Africa, and we've thought about how that links into the key question of how did different people experience the British Empire. So we've seen some examples, the Anglo-Zulu War, and about how Zululand was incorporated into South Africa. And we've also found out about Benin, and we've also found out about the Ndebele Kingdom and how that was incorporated into Rhodesia. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.